Good morning, this is Eyisegun once again, and today I'd like to speak to us about salvation. In general terms, when we hear about salvation and messages relating to salvation, we think more of the evangelical dimension of the topic, and we generally tend to assume that it's geared towards people who are not yet in relationship with Christ, who are not saved or born again, who haven't become born again Christians. But today I want to talk about salvation as it relates to people who are a major part of the church, either as attenders or attendees, as pastors, ministers, deacons, people who serve in some sort of ministry. They could be in the choir, they could be an usher, and that sort of thing. So today I'm speaking to those people who, in their own understanding and in their own minds, honestly believe that they are Christians, but they aren't. And I have to go back a few years to build up this case. In the year 2000, no later than 2001, but I know it was towards the end of 2000, the year 2000, I was asked to come and speak at a particular event that was organized by the ministers of a particular church. And as is my custom, I asked God what I should say there. The point being that if He didn't give me anything to say, I wasn't going to honor it, that invitation. So, and He gave me the topic, "Are you really saved?" That kind of threw me for a bit, because I had been invited to minister on this platform quite a number of times, and I had an idea of the people who would be there, and the people consisted of church leaders, church elders, and all of that sort of stuff, ministry leaders, as it were. Maybe there were one or two newly converted people, but in the main, most of the people were established Christians and leaders in their own churches. So I got into this discussion or debate with God, thinking, well, God, you definitely must have gotten this wrong. I don't think that this could be right. And I said, God, but I know these people. I know what positions they hold in their various churches. So how can I be asking this question? And then I remembered a few years back when I spoke in a church that I was a member of, and let's just say that the leadership didn't like the things I said. Not that I said anything wrong, but there's a different ball game anyway. I won't go into the details. It wasn't that I brought a word that was corrective or anything. I brought a word of encouragement, but there were just aspects that they just didn't expect from what they deemed a lay person who was not a minister in the church. And so there was some sort of animosity towards me thereafter. And I remember one Sunday I came home and I said, God, I need to know if I'm the Antichrist, because that's how I felt in the way I was being treated. I need to know if I'm the Antichrist, because if these words that I'm speaking are not from you, then I need to know and check myself, so I don't go around or go and say something that upsets people and then they start to fight me. And then I remember saying that, it's either I'm of the darkness or they are, but somebody's got to be, because as far as I'm aware, light and light never clash. They don't fight. Light is never at war with light. And if I'm of the light, how come they don't recognize me? They also being of the light. Why are they against me? And I just heard in my spirit Revelations 3:9. And Revelations 3:9 talks of those who claim to be Jews but lie. And Revelations 3:9 further goes on to call them people who are of the synagogue of Satan. In other words, they're claiming to be Jews. They're not really Jews, but they're really of the synagogue of Satan. And I understood that to mean that there are people who are masquerading as Christians. They're involved, they go to church, they even become leaders, ministers, pastors, and all these things. But they're not Christians at all. They're of the synagogue of Satan, while claiming to be Jews, but lie. That's how Revelation 9 describes them. And so there are people who we would readily identify as Christians because of the positions they hold in church, because they're in church often, because they quote scripture and everything. But as far as God is concerned, who knows them, he knows that they are not Christians. In other words, they've never had a conversion experience. And that was a shock to my system. It took a while to accept that understanding, that people could be a part of this thing and could be yet not be a part of it at all. And I sort of took it on board after a while, and I recognized that. And then, of course, it was thereafter that I went to this meeting, and I had to preach, "Are you really saved?" That was the title of my message. So I went to this meeting, and I spoke, to a people who are in the faith. And towards the end, and using scripture, I broke down the ingredients or the components of a true or a genuine salvation experience, inviting us to look at the experiences that we have had in terms of our conversion experience, weigh it against what the word shows us, and determine where we fall. Now, the essence of that was not to expose people. I didn't do an altar call and ask people who are ministers in their churches to come up if they hadn't. But we could go home and examine ourselves. And if we hadn't, then we could position ourselves for a genuine conversion experience. But for us to have a genuine conversion experience, we need to actually know what it is and what's involved in a genuine conversion experience. Needless to say that, some people didn't like me after that, but that's by the way. Now, this happened in 2000. And as with the passage of time, I forgot all about it, sort of. But I had a very, very scary experience in 2010, around October. It was, which forms the main platform for the message that I bring on this occasion. I had a dream. And in this dream I suddenly found myself in Victoria Station. Now, Victoria Station is in London. And I say that because there are people who watch this who don't live in England. And I suddenly found that I was on the concourse of the mainline station, not the tube station, the mainline station. And there was this very, very, very tall man. He was well over 7 foot. I remember looking at him, and I had to really, really, crook my neck and to see him. He was tall, and he was wearing a robe with seemed white, not brilliant white, but it just seemed sort of off-white. And he had like a brown belt. It was almost something like out of the Bible, a character out of the Bible. And he was of Mediterranean Mediterranean persuasion, and we were we were walking along the platform, and I noticed that it was miles longer than I ever remembered Victoria Station to be. And when I looked up, and I remember that there's a lot of light coming in, so when I looked up I could see that the ceiling for the entirety of the station was glass. And it was a nice sunny day, there was a lot of light coming in, and there was a lot of light coming in, and it was just amazing. You know, you probably had to wear sunglasses to see the light, it was that dazzling. But I looked up and I was thinking, wow, it's so light in here, you know. And where we stood on the concourse, in front of us, high up on a rack, there was the notice board. The notice board tells you what trains are coming in, where they're going, what time they're coming in, what time they're leaving, and what platform the trains are going to be leaving from, as well as their destination. But it was blank. There were no train times. There was nothing on it. And then there were lots of people, but I'll get to that. The first thing that struck me, apart from the ceiling and the light, was there was a lot of noise. And they were playing from the station. They had speakers all over the place, you know, tucked away that you couldn't see. But you just heard a lot of hip-hop coming through. And it was loud. I mean, it was so loud. I had to talk to the guy that I was standing with. And I said, look, you know, why is it so loud? You know, why can't they turn this thing down? You know, this is too noisy. And it really, really got on my nerves. And although he didn't say anything to me with his mouth, I could hear him responding to me in his thoughts. And he said, no, this is the way it's going to be for eternity. And I said, oh, really? I mean, they're going to be playing this? He said, yes, this is the way it's going to be for eternity. You know, I didn't understand what he was saying at that point, in the sense that when he said this is how it's going to be for eternity, I had no idea where we were. I was in Victoria Station. I couldn't understand why they were going to be blaring music for eternity without turning the volume down. It was just too loud. The other thing that I noticed was that along the walls, right up on towards the ceiling, the glass ceilings, all along the walls, there were these, you know, those stadium lights that you get, you know, where it's got a batch of lights with a grid with several rows of lights, you know, light bulbs, and they had that all the way around the stadium. All the way around the stadium, they had that, and I remember thinking, and all the lights were on. So I was thinking, where we have a transparent roof because it's glass, it's as bright as day. Why are the lights on in the day? And the lights were blinding. I mean, there was just so much light. I don't understand why it was necessary. I can understand if they turned those lights on at night, but in the daytime I didn't see the point. But that went. And then I looked at the people. First thing I noticed was that all the people were black. Second thing I noticed was that, and I don't know how I knew this, but I knew that all of the people came from the same church. They were all from a particular church, which is probably one of the largest black churches in the UK, at least in London, if not the UK. And I remember thinking that they were probably between the ages of 18 to about 28. I'd be hard pressed to find anybody who was 30 years old. Maximum I'd put, you know, if they did have a few of those people, no more than 32, if at all. And there were loads of them, and they were very well dressed. You could tell that, and their clothes were casual, but they weren't cheap. So you knew that these people were coming from either middle class or upper middle class homes. They weren't poor by any stretch of imagination. There was nobody there that was poor. Everybody came from some sort of semi-moneyed background. And they stood in clusters of 5, 10, 6, 5, 10, 8, you know, that sort of small groups. And they sort of stood in a sort of circle. And some of them had backpacks, you know, leather backpacks, not cloth, but proper leather backpacks. And some of them had their backpacks on the floor. Some of them wore shorts. It was very summery. And some of them had iPods. And they stood in these clusters, you know. And I noticed that even though there were quite a variety of clusters, because there were quite a few of them there, they all were swaying. I don't know if it was to the hip hop or to what they were listening to, but then not all of them had iPods, you know, with the earpieces in, you know. But they were all swaying very gently but noticeably. They were swaying from left to right, you know, and just sort of shaking the head, you know, just a little nod, and you know, and I noticed that. And then the other thing I noticed, that they all had this kind of look. Nobody said a word, but I could hear them looking at each other as if, yeah, they had this sort of triumphalist look, expression on their faces. Like, yeah, we made it. Yeah, we made it, you know. Yeah. It was that sort of look, you know. And I noted that. But every so often I would look up at the notice boards to see what train was coming in and all of that. And I looked around and I noticed that nobody was looking. And so we were standing there, and suddenly people just started rushing through the gates to onto the platform to a particular train. So this chap that I was standing with, Mediterranean-looking chap, and I, we just joined the fray, and we got on the train. Now I remember noting that nobody looked. We just saw a train, and people just made a motion in the direction of the train. The other thing that caught my attention was, as we were moving down the platform, I realized that there were two trains, but everybody went and boarded the first train, which would obviously be the first train out. So there are two trains on the one platform, and everybody boarded the first train. So we got on, and suddenly we were in a room. Actually, it wasn't a room, it was a carriage. And the carriage was as long as a motorway or an expressway. And if you imagine that if you stand at one end of an express road or a motorway, you can't see right to the end. You can see as far as you can see. And that's how this carriage was. And we were standing near the entrance. And then I noticed that there were beds, and these beds went for as long as there was carriage, and the beds had white sheets. The beds had white sheets, I remember. And initially I couldn't quite see what was on the beds, but after a while I could see properly, because the room had no windows that you could open, and it had just one light bulb, and it was not a very bright light. And so I saw kind of movement, and I saw somebody roll over, and on closer inspection I saw lots of people on these beds. They had no clothes on, but they covered themselves in the white sheets, you know, with white covers. They had white wrappers or whatever if they wanted to. And then I looked at the first bed, and I realized that this man, this young chap that I had seen, who probably was in his 30s, was having sex with a lady who I actually know. And so I was watching. I couldn't see what was going on because they were under the sheets, but you kind of knew what was going on. And then as I looked further down, you know, all of the other beds, I saw that there are people who were just lying there on their backs. And then I saw people roll over people to get to another person to have sex with them. And then I noticed that the ceiling was so low where the beds were that you couldn't stand upright. You couldn't even kneel on the bed and kneel upright. The only way you could get from one end is to roll over people. That's how low the ceiling was. So that kind of stunned me for a bit, and so I proceeded to speak with the chap on the first bed, but he couldn't hear me, so I had to join them. So I took off my clothes and I got into bed. I was completely naked, and so I asked him, I said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "Well, this is where we find ourselves." I said, "What do you do here?" He says, "Well, we just have sex." I said, what do you mean you just have sex? He says, yes, that that's what we do here, we just have sex, and that, you know, when you finish with one, you can roll over and you can go as far down as possible and roll back as, I said, but for how long are you going to be doing this? And he said, we're going to be doing this for eternity. Now, because I was standing with the angel prior to getting on the bed, where we were standing, we were able to stand, and the ceiling was high enough. But everywhere else had a very low ceiling. So you couldn't stand upright, you couldn't kneel upright, you just had to lie down. That was all you could do, and roll over to the next person. There was no getting off the bed. You couldn't get off and stand on the floor. You were just going to be there rolling. And it was a very claustrophobic place, and I was thinking they're going to do this. And then I put my clothes on, and then I was standing with the angel, and I remember saying to him, they're going to do this for eternity. I said, all they're going to do is have sex. Now, sex is a beautiful thing. Well, when you at a certain age, you think there's nothing greater and better than sex, but on this occasion, it was the most revolting thing. Coupled with the fact that they couldn't get up, they couldn't stretch, and I kept thinking, these people are never going to stand upright forever, for eternity. And coupled with the fact that there was no sanitation, so even though the beddings were white, those beddings were only white because they had just gotten in. But as time went on, imagine that people were going to wet themselves, people were going to pass feces, women were going to have their monthlies, and people were not going to brush their teeth, and people weren't going to, you know, shave or wash their armpits and all the other bits, you know, areas of concern. And you know, there was no deodorants, there was nothing, there's no toothpaste, and all of this stuff that I mentioned was going to be done on a bed. There was no disposal can, there's no garbage can. Everything happened and started and finished on the bed, and people were going to be rolling around in this muck. And so imagine that you've got 3,000 people in there all the way down, and they all go to the toilet for a year, you know, on their beds. They wee on their beds. There's no dry cleaning, there's no change of sheets, there's nothing. And you roll over and you sleep in it, you wake up in it, you have sex with a woman in it, and then you have to have sex with a woman, and you probably have sex with a woman who hasn't had a wash for 6 months, 8 months now, and this, or 8 months or 10 months, and this was going to go on for eternity. It was one of the most sickening things I have ever experienced. It was really, really gut-wrenching. You almost wanted to throw up. You know, there was no air freshener, there was no facility by which you could open the window and let air in. There was just, and there was only this small light, one bulb. And imagine that you have a room big enough to house 3,000, and then you have a 60-watt bulb. How much light can there possibly be in that place? And all of a sudden, you know, sex wasn't very, very appealing. You know, it was a horrible, horrible, horrible. And unfortunately, I don't have, my vocabulary is not so vast as to be able to adequately capture in words what I saw, but it was the most disgusting, revolting spectacle that I have ever come across. And if you imagine that you go and visit a site where a bomb has gone off and you see limbs and bodies and everything, I am telling you that that pales into comparison. This was worse. This was worse than digging up a decomposed corpse and watching and observing it. It was just horrible, especially because these people were living, they were not dead. So they were going to decompose in a living state. It was awful. And the guy I was with, who at some point I thought, well, he must be an angel because he's very tall and he looked biblical, you know. He had a garment on and a waistband, a brown one. So I thought, well, he must be an angel, but he wasn't saying anything to me, you know. And I kept looking at him in astonishment that, you know, these people are going to be like this and everything. And he didn't say a word, but I could hear his thoughts and his response through his thoughts. And then suddenly we were in another carriage, which was carriage number 2. While we were in carriage number 2, the first thing I noticed that how fast this train was traveling. I mean, it was really traveling at speed, you know. And so the angel looked at a door, and he didn't say a word to me, but I could hear his thoughts, because I was thinking, how are we going to get off? Because it occurred to me that this train doesn't stop. And he showed me that on the platform of the stop there is a door, the platform doors. And of course there are two doors that come together, and then there are the train doors as well. There are two doors that come together. Now in real life, when the train pulls up in a platform and those doors match, they align, the outer doors of the train and doors of the platform, they're in alignment, then the doors will open. But because the trains were not stopping, this was what happened. Now the platform doors are two doors coming together, same as the train doors, so there's a little gap that divides the two doors, and there's a little gap that divides the two doors on the train, so both platform and train. When the train, which is traveling at speed, gets to a point where the two train doors and the platform doors align, as they would if the train actually stopped, anybody who could jump through this invisible gap between both doors would land on the platform. And that's what this angel and I did. Actually, it was at that point I knew he was an angel, because we jumped through this gap. I mean, this train was traveling at such speed that, you know, you blinked and you missed it. And I was thinking, well, if people don't know that this is what you do, how do you get off at a platform or at any stop? Because the train doesn't actually stop. But we got off, and I remember when we got off, it was pitch black, pitch black. If you've ever seen an oil slick and you've actually handled the oil, you know, it's sticky, gooey and thick and very, very black. That's how thick the darkness was. You could almost touch it and pull it out of the air. That's how thick it was and oppressive. And there was again one small bulb at the end of the platform, and there was nobody there until suddenly I saw a movement, and I saw, it seemed as though a metal shiny object was moving, but it was a human being as it got closer. And this metal shiny stainless steel looking object was a piece of metal, like a pipe, embedded in the person's head. And whilst I was wondering what the heck that was about and what was going on, somebody just came out from a corner, and the next thing, he had a metal shiny object and he buried it in the man's head, and the man's head split into two, and it was an axe, and it stayed there. And then suddenly people came out, and there was from different parts of the platform. They just emerged from the darkness, and they all had metal objects sticking out of one part of their body or the other, and there was an almighty brawl. Now, I don't particularly like violence, but I do sometimes think that some people need a very good hiding. But I can assure you, and in my youth, I'd observed a few vicious fights, physical fights, fights that involved bottles, and fights that involved machetes and knives. So I'd seen some of those things in my youth. But this was the king and queen and the mother of all vicious fights. It was so violent. It was, if you had a weak constitution, you would have spent the whole experience throwing up. It was violent to the point of sickening, and I couldn't take it. So I started to move amongst the people, and again, they were all black people. Oh, I have to say this, that all the people I saw on the concourse at Victoria were all Nigerians. They were Nigerians. So there were no English people, there were no Italians, it was pure Nigerians. But coming back to the platform now, to the platform that I was on. So I said, but why are you fighting? Your brothers, your brother in humanity, look, you know, and all of that sort of stuff. And I was really trying to broker peace. And this angel person just stood there and he didn't say a word. He just let me carry on. And every so often I'd look at him to say, can't you do something and everything? And he just looked at me and he wouldn't answer me. And so I tried and tried, and just when I thought I'd make a headway, somebody would break out, another fight would break out somewhere else, and it was really, really nauseatingly violent. And after a while, I started to cry. I started to cry. I was extremely saddened, and I started to cry. And when I looked at the angel, he didn't say anything to me, but I could hear him saying that there's nothing you can do, it's too late. This is what's going to happen for the rest of eternity. Now, there was no blood or anything, but I have never seen such violence in all my existence, and I can assure you, I have seen violence. It was just awful. I'll tell you this, you would never want to even slap a human being if you had observed this. And I was like, but God, and at this stage I was standing right beside this angel who was standing to my right, and suddenly it hit me. We were in hell. And then I panicked. Now, prior to my panic, if you go to most tube stations, you will find, or tube platforms, you will find that there's, one side where the train's going out and another side when the train's coming back in. I realized that we were on the train that was going out, but there were no trains coming back in. You know, and then after it occurred to me that we were in hell. And then I panicked. If that happened to me in real life, I would have wet myself, I would have doodled my pants on the spot, I would have thrown up, and then I would have had a heart attack all at the same time. The fear that gripped me, the panic that gripped me, my heart was palpitating, and I nearly died. I thought at one point I thought my spirit could no longer cope with what I was seeing and my understanding of my environment and where I was, and so my heart started to faint, and I didn't know how we were going to get out, and that made me panic all the more. And even though I didn't run around or anything, and I was standing beside this angel, all of this panic was going inside of me, and then I thought, I'm going to die. I can't, you know. I was frightened. I was, you know, and the angel kind of understood what was happening with me. He didn't look at me, but he just took me by the hand. And when he took me by the hand, I was at peace. And suddenly, we were back on the train. And so, when we got on the train again, I noticed that the train was not, the track wasn't straight, but there was a curve. It was descending, and suddenly I felt a heat as the train was progressing, and then there was a very steep curve, and the train would go straight down. So it sort of started off on a straight level, and then it curved a bit, and then there was a sharp decline, you know, and the train would just go right down. Now, we didn't get to the end of the line, but somehow I could see the end of the line, and how I describe what I saw, apart from the ferocious heat, was like if you have a massive pit with red molten metal. Now, if you burn metal long enough, it has that red look, you know, that orange red, you know, that sort of furnace look. And all I saw was this one big massive furnace, And then I started to panic again, you know. And I didn't know how we were going to get back to the platform because there were no trains coming back. And in the midst of all of this, I suddenly heard a sob. And then I heard another sob. And I turned round and I saw this young man. He wasn't any more than 28. And he looked like somebody had just withdrawn all iota of hope and life from this man. He looked so crestfallen and despondent. And then I heard another sob and I turned round and then I saw that all the seats in the carriage were occupied with these people that I had seen on the platform, or occupied by these people that I had seen on the concourse before we got on the train. And they all sat down with their heads bowed, as you would do in an aeroplane if you're about to crash. And one lady sobbed. But the rest of the carriage, people were shell-shocked. And nobody said anything to me. But the lady was saying, how did we wind up here? I remember. She said, how did we wind up here? How did we wind up here? We're going to hell for eternity. How did we wind up here? And people were stunned, and so stunned that they couldn't even speak. So it was just this lady and this chap. But the guy only sobbed once and he didn't say anything. He just looked so forlorn, and it was awful. And they couldn't understand why they were going to hell. Of course, the train was progressing, and I could see this molten place, and I suddenly understood that it was the pit of hell. And that's where the train stops. And though the angel didn't speak with words, I could hear his mind, his thoughts. And he was telling me that, well, before he told me this, he could see that as the train was progressing, it was obviously getting very hotter. And I suddenly came to the awareness, well, he said it to me, that the experience of hell gets worse with every stop. So if we were to get off on another platform, what I experienced would be worse than my last platform. And honestly, I was just thinking, how do I get out of here? I was internally panicking. And the angel said to me, he knew that I couldn't cope. He said, look, you know, I know that you can't. He just told me, he says, look, it gets worse with every platform stop, with every stop, until you get to the pit of hell. But he knew that I couldn't cope with the toll, and he held me by the hand again, and suddenly we were back on the concourse where we started off at Victoria Station. And he didn't say anything to me, but suddenly I looked at him and I knew who he was. He wasn't an angel. It was Jesus. I'm going to end it here for today. I find it very difficult to talk about this, and I will conclude it maybe tomorrow or the day after. But that was my experience in 2010. I haven't written a book about it, and I don't intend to. This is not a story that you sort of try and make money out of. This is about people who were in the church, people who had spent a lot of their lives in the church, and yet wound up in hell. The thing I also want to say is this, that they didn't look at the notice board to see what train was coming in and where it was going. They all just got on. The train came and bang, they just went with it. I also noticed that there were no pastors or elders in sight. It was just congregation members, and there were lots of them. I can assure you, you see that lake of fire, pit of hell thing? It's real. It really is real. And I came away. Let me tell you something. Until you've been there, you will never understand the mercy of God. You know how you say, oh, let this person go to hell, and oh, this corrupt politician, this evil dictator, may you rot in hell and everything. I'm telling you, it's because you've never been to hell. If you've been to hell, you will be praying for God's mercy, that even so much so that even the worst human being on the face of the earth, you will not desire to go to that place. I don't care if they killed your wife, raped your children, ate them for breakfast. I am telling you that if you had had this experience and after coming out of that experience, people raped your children, killed your wife, ate your kids after they raped them for food and all of that sort, burned your house down, and Jesus came and said, should I send them to hell? You would say, God, have mercy. People who say go to hell and do all of that sort of stuff is because they don't understand. It is not a place for anyone to go, even the deserving. But I'll end it here, and I'll come back on this topic again tomorrow. Thanks for listening.